Another major difficulty lies in the very implementation of the Paris Agreement itself. The agreement was a strong and new framework of principles and commitments. Now it needs a rulebook for concrete implementation. The so-called Paris rulebook is right now being discussed and should be formally approved at the COP24 in Katowice in Poland next December. Up to now, discussions are very difficult. In that perspective, important decisions have to be made on key issues like transparency, which is never easy, monitoring, and financing. With the Paris Agreement, wealthy nations have reaffirmed their commitment to show solidarity towards the more vulnerable by spending in 2020 at least $100 billion a year, public and private sector together, on climate concerns in poor countries. This commitment has to be honored with increased efforts from the public sector, especially in order to finance adaptation and not only mitigation in developing countries. Mitigation and adaptation are the true crucial pillars of climate action, and their specific aspects for the Mediterranean and the Middle East will be addressed, I think, tomorrow morning. In short, the coming period of 2018-2020 represent undoubtedly the decisive 3 years period. The environment in general and the climate in particular will face the moment of truth. Last November in Bonn, COP23 launched this period along with the One Planet Summit last December in Paris. Next September, the IPCC report on the conditions for staying below the 1.5 degrees, and then the San Francisco Global Climate Action Summit, organized by the governor of California, will take place. Then we shall have a COP24 in Poland, which will draw the conclusions of the so-called Talanoa dialogue launched by the Fiji Islands, currently running the COP23 presidency. Next year, in 2019, many events will take place, and among them, the UN Climate Summit organized by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and we shall have COP25. Next year, in 2020, the upward revision of national contributions, the effective availability of funding and technologies, the full implementation of the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity in China, and hopefully, and we'll say a few words about it in a moment, the adoption of the Global Pact will take place. These are some of the steps that will be taken in the next 3 years. Therefore, there is not a moment to lose, for we are in a race against time, and different disciplines and events are all interconnected. Because, and this is a point I would like to stress, climate change is not a sectoral problem. It is a cross-cutting issue. Climate disruption has some obvious consequences on biodiversity, as it implies a modification of the ecosystems, driving many species to extinction. But it also has direct and severe consequences on development, health, food, security, migrations, and at the end of the day, on peace and security. And it's not a hazard if IPCC has got the Nobel Prize for Peace and not for another discipline. All these issues are closely interrelated, and the Institute has completely understood that. The Mediterranean and Middle East regions that are at the core of our conference, with some differences, probably between North and South and different countries, illustrate these interrelations. The session of this afternoon will be dedicated to the impacts of climate change in the region and reciprocal impacts on health, agriculture, water, and food. Tourism, weather extreme, sustainable development, migration, security, and peace. Therefore, one can speak about a Middle East and North Africa challenge with differences within the region. We all know, for example, that droughts are jeopardizing the development of certain regions and causing mass population movements, that increasing frequency of dust storm episodes leads to a range of respiratory illnesses, or that climate change enhances the spread of vector-borne diseases like dengue fever, a subject that I know is of particular concern here. All this shows that tackling climate change should not be a standalone policy, but a systemic one. Since all issues are connected, we need both specific and global and cross-cutting solution, ranging from education to energy transition policy, ranging from sharing of experience on concrete measures in order to upgrade nationally determined contribution to socio-economic approach and to governance itself. As for this question of policy challenges and policy options, we will have the opportunity to hear prominent voices, I think tomorrow afternoon, among others Jeffrey Sachs and former EU Commissioner or EU Commissioner, and I think it will be of the greatest interest. Ladies and gentlemen, I have used the word systemic, the word interrelated, and it is precisely the aim of the project I mentioned, the Global Pact for the Environment, and because I am lucky enough to have this audience, I would like to say a few words about these new initiatives. My belief, because all these elements are included in the notion of environment, my belief is that we need an international treaty also, gathering in a realistic way the fundamental principles of environmental law, not only in the climate sector, but in the different sectors. Until now, these principles, which do exist, have been enshrined in declarations with no legal value. For the last decades, experts of environmental law have presented a series of projects of global environmental treaties, which were excellent, but they lacked the necessary political support and were not able to succeed. But in 2015, because of the adoption of the UN SDG and the Paris Agreement, a momentum has been created, allowing, hopefully, further action. In this context, shortly after I left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and became president of the Constitutional Court, I was invited to support the project of a global pact for the environment. The first draft has been elaborated by an international network of leading legal experts from 40 different countries, among them representative of this region and representing various situations and various legal cultures. The project was presented in Paris in June 2017, endorsed very strongly by French President Macron, and officially launched during the UN General Assembly last September. And since then, the diplomatic phase has been underway. What could be the content of this global pact for the environment, which, and I insist on that, will be compatible with the numerous, about 500, and very useful existing sectorial international agreements? The draft proposed to establish some fundamental rights: right to live in a healthy environment, sovereignty over natural resources, common but differentiated responsibilities, a right to information and public participation on environmental matters, and so on and so forth, as well as duties with regard to nature, the duty to take care of the environment, the prevention principle, the famous polluter pays principle, etc. The aim is, in a short text, to conciliate environmental preservation, social progress, and sustainable development goals. Most of these principles are already widely known and consensual, and they are rising from the 1992 Rio Declaration, but the pact would enshrine some innovations too. And for example, the principle that we call non-regression, which means that every state, indeed, can decide new and specific rules, but there can be no backsliding in the general level, I insist on the word general, of its environmental protection. The vital role of non-state actors in the field of environment is acknowledged too, and the draft, which has been established by our group, is meant as an inspiration for further diplomatic discussions. And regarding these discussions, we very recently received good news, because exactly 1 week ago, the UN General Assembly voted a first resolution establishing a working group to discuss this Global Pact project and asking the UN Secretary General to deliver a report on the matter by the end of this year. This resolution has met a wide approval since 143 states vote in favor of it, against only 5 no's. And I want to thank particularly all the support we have for various countries, and in particular Cyprus. Now we have to open formal diplomatic negotiation next year in order, and I know it's very, very ambitious along the UN standards, to adopt, hopefully, the treaty in the years 2020-2021. The pact will enable the consolidation and dissemination of the general principles of environmental law, encouraging the development of legislation and case law. It will be a tool available to all states as they implement the 2030 Agenda on SDG, which includes most of the principles of the Rio Declaration. Acknowledging the principle of CBDR, it will make it possible to create a space where the same environmental norms could be applied to all, making it easier for international companies to undertake necessary formalities and to ensure that they carry out their social and environmental responsibility. It will provide greater predictability and legal security, which is always important in this domain, and will give new guarantees to citizens with regard to states' actions for the protection of the environment, and will strengthen citizens' capacity to assert their environmental rights before national courts according to national legislation. The key point is now to ensure that the need for the pact, which is supported by all European countries, is widely recognized and the states carry out the negotiation in a constructive manner. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the Paris Agreement was never intended as the end of the road. Its aim was and is to be the start of new, intense and collective efforts to tackle climate change and the general deterioration of our environment. The Eastern Mediterranean, which is supported by all European countries, is widely recognized and the states carry out the negotiation in a constructive manner. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the Paris Agreement was never intended as the end of the road. Its aim was and is to be the start of new, intense and collective efforts to tackle climate change and the general deterioration of our environment. The Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region is part and parcel of this worldwide challenge, but with obvious specificity. You don't have to have in mind from the remarks I presented to you a negative view, not at all. But I think if we want, and it's an absolute necessity, to move forward, we have to know exactly what is the situation. The Middle East region is part and parcel of this worldwide challenge, but with obvious specificity. You don't have to have in mind from the remarks I presented to you a negative view, not at all. But I think if we want, and it's an absolute necessity, to move forward, we have to know exactly what is the situation and what are the challenges. It is why this conference and our common efforts are so important. Not only we cannot slow down, but on the contrary, we need to speed up the pace. The environmental threat is planetary, therefore the response must be planetary too, and an institute like ours plays a decisive role in this direction. Thank you.